Okay, so as I just mentioned to Maggie, I know a lot of you will be viewing this at a later time from home and are not with us live. However, those of you who are with us live, if you do have questions, please enter it into the Q&A throughout. I'm going to welcome you by telling you a little bit about the Country Bookshop in downtown Southern Pines, North Carolina. We are unique in that we are a bookstore that is part of a small community, twice weekly, award-winning newspaper called The Pilot. We are a general bookstore for kids and adults that is part of a community that chooses to shop with us and share their stories and lives with us and celebrate such lovely thinking and writing like Maggie has given us in Great Circle. Maggie, welcome.
Thank you.
I want to thank you not only for writing this particular book, but also for agreeing to speak with me to kind of create a conversation uniquely for the country bookshop community. I know you've probably said all that you want to say in Great Circle. And not only that, but you've been talking about the book kind of all the time. And I wanted to thank you for all those conversations. And also, as this video goes out to the people who've signed up for it and also in the chat, there are two conversations I'm going to reference. And I hope that for all of y'all, you will take a look at those. The first one that will be linked to is the one you did with Julian Sancton for the Country Bookshelf in Montana, who we sometimes get like random shipments confused. Publishers.
I bet. Yeah.
And the other one is the one you did for Square Books for Book Page. I thought that was with the editor.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was
with Kat. Yeah.
Yeah, she was great. But I think they covered so many things that people are curious about so well and so elegantly. And so kind of instead of this conversation going over some of those questions, I'm kind of assuming that all of you listening will loop those in as the backdrop, since this is really for people who've read the book and for book clubs. So to that end, for those of you watching or listening, if you have not read the book, maybe put a pin in this and come back after you've read the book. We're not going to worry in our conversation about spoiling anything. We are going to speak for an audience that we are assuming has read the book. So just stop if you haven't read the book. But before, Maggie, you reference in the book about Hadley dealing with this like amorphous truth that's too big to gather. And that's totally how I feel conversing about this book with you. I want to start, you dedicated the book to your brother, and many in the Country Bookshop kind of family are familiar with him. And, as I keep putting this book in people's hands, this one story has been repeated to me several times, which you've probably heard as well. But there was a report that your brother wrote for work that just like astounded everybody who read it. And they're like, this is the most amazingly written thing, we've ever read. And apparently his response was like, yeah, I'm like the worst writer in my family. I mean, that keeps coming back. But I was wondering about your family. Your parents have been in the bookshop, and all I wanted to do is ask them what they did to raise two people who've kind of moved through the world like with such a profound effect on everyone. But just I have a couple questions about your family, but I'm curious what kind of characterized their skills as parents, or if you had kind of an understanding growing up of where you fit in your own family timeline, like generations going back, and how that might have informed your writing, or I know also, if you didn't want to go there, how your mother was kind of with you during some of your Arctic adventures and your first reader, and if you could just speak to how they informed it.
Yeah, for sure. So my mom is, both my parents are retired now. My dad was a lawyer and my mom was a child development professor, which I think really informed her parenting. She studied early child, and so she taught people who were going to teach elementary school and preschool teachers, mostly elementary school. So she really knows about children, and I think she was just always really supportive of whatever our interests were, and there was no real pressure to excel. She didn't really apply, I don't know, stringent concrete standards to it. So it was just sort of whatever. And a story I've told, which then showed up in this really weird way in a profile about me, was like when my brother was a toddler, like 2 or 3, he really liked garbage men, which many toddlers do, love the truck. And so he had his little toy trash cans, and my mom would drive around behind the garbage truck and like let him look at it. So there wasn't any sense of like, no, Matthew, you can't be a garbage man. It was like, sure, you're into garbage, let's go check it out. Which then that ended up in a British newspaper. There was a story about me, and they were like, we think like much of the family's energy went into Maggie because her brother aspired to be a garbage man. I was like, no, as a 2-year-old. My brother was, a very brilliant person, but is pretty quiet about it. So, and then like going further back, I guess, no one in my family is really an artist or writer of any kind. I remember at some point when one of my grandparents died, I guess my grandma, which was 20 years ago, I found a letter my dad had written to her when I was like 5 or 6, really little. And he said something explicitly like, I think she might be the artist this family has never had. It was really strange. And he doesn't remember writing it at all. But so I guess I was the sort of volatile, temperamental one. I think that's why they were just like, this kid's difficult. So, but and I don't know how much my family informed the book. Certainly my brother, he stopped flying about 10 years ago, but he was a pilot in the Air Force, just retired. And my paternal grandfather was a career Army officer. And he was, I guess there's a little bit because the book delves into Charles Lindbergh somewhat. And he was kind of a famous figure in the family, obviously problematic person with some Nazi sympathies, but he had been friendly with my paternal grandfather's uncle, who was a United States Senator from Minnesota. And so there are these pictures of them having dinner, and this famous story where whoever was supposed to serve the dinner quit. And so my grandpa, who was a teenager at the time, kind of right off the farm, had to step in and serve dinner to the senator and Charles Lindbergh. Yeah.
So my next question, so much of the book is exploring these kind of tiny, unique subcultures, LA movie culture, like the culture of pilots, women in the military, art world, bush pilot culture in Alaska. And I know your book is about so much more than the Arctic, but it seemed like a lot of your thinking about other areas of the book were shaped during your Arctic travels. And in your interview with Julian Sankton, you kind of allude to like how far south you had gone, and like, you referenced some of the people who kind of inhabit that space. And it just seemed like this ultimate subculture with like codes and rules of like hierarchy, like the cool, what constitutes as cool, like in there is something I'm just very curious about, that particular subculture. And I was wondering if you could talk about some of the people living in those places that you've encountered during your Arctic journeys.
Sure. Yeah, that's so funny. It's true. I think when people get, particularly with Antarctica, when people get really into it, there is kind of this really specialized knowledge. I think for the vast majority of people, you're like, it's down there somewhere, it's big, it's cold. And then you kind of know, like, you start to learn about like different lines of latitude and how far south is really far south. I've been to Antarctica twice. I've been to the Arctic about 5 times. And Antarctica, the usual way to go, which I think I talked about with Julian, is from South America. And it's by far the most accessible way. And the second time I went was on a travel assignment, and that's how we did it. My mom came with me. And it's just sort of one day across the Drake Passage, which can be really rough, but then you get there. And the first time I went was from New Zealand, and that you kind of weave your way down through these islands. And then even from the southernmost island, it's like 5 days at sea. And it's this like, the Southern Ocean's just crazily stormy. And so we had these huge, it was just routine to have 15-foot swells. That was like a normal day. And then the big days would be more like 30 plus feet. And you just sort of like, get used to being rolled.
How big was that ship?
It was like 200 feet,
Okay.
like 50 passengers. So it was substantial. And it was a Russian meteorological research vessel from the 70s. So it was sort of designed to withstand heavy conditions, but I was bartending. And so I'd like be like trying to pour drinks as the ship rolls, and people would insist on getting their tall glasses. And I'd be like, can you just have the can? And they're like, no, I want a glass. And then they'd, of course, forget, like the ship would stabilize for a second, they'd let go, and it'd like, everything would go crashing over. Anyway, yeah. And so I was really interested in like the people who are guides down there. They just have a really specific sort of knowledge of this place that's really mysterious to most of us, and really forbidding and really dangerous. And the same is true in the north. Like, you know, it's different up there. Like, people live much further north than they do live south. There's sort of no permanent inhabitants on Antarctica, just sort of transient scientists and support staff. Whereas in the north, you know, the Inuit have lived there for thousands of years and have this culture that's very tied to the landscape and the wildlife. And I think people I met up there and also in the south, I was just sort of fascinated by their competence and the way they could make these places work for themselves. So that very much started to kind of go into Marian the more I encountered them.
You know, you talked in some of your interviews about how those who are able to survive in like super intense situations are people who maintain their sense of wonder. Did these people kind of carry that with them, or were they just, or
I
was
think
it
it's a
different?
little different because like the people who live there permanently and people who work there, to them it's become normal. You know, they're used to it, they know what they have to do. Certainly like some extreme situations can arise, but the wonder thing was in this book by Lawrence Gonzalez called Deep Survival, and it was sort
Mhm.
of like looking at shipwreck survivors in lifeboats, or people who get lost in the mountains, or this and that. And one sort of uniting fact amongst people who sort of survive is that they're still like, and the stars were so beautiful on day 45 in the lifeboat, you know, and it sort of seemed to keep them connected to the real world. Whereas some people say in that lifeboat, you know, after 40 days, will just have a complete break and go swimming with the sharks, and that's it, you know. So that was, to me, that said a lot about just the power of kind of appreciating the world around you. It's not just aesthetic, it's also just about grounding yourself.
Interesting. So it's more like the environments shift when it's a new environment
Mm-hmm.
almost.
Yeah, and I mean, I think people who live and work in the high latitudes do um, appreciate the beauty, but it's also, I mean, especially for people who live in the Arctic, when they have, you know, this long dark winter and then this crazy, you know, 24 hours of daylight summer. I think that's just something that you have to sort of adapt to and endure in a way, especially the winter.
So I want to talk a little bit about creativity. Like, you know, we're always talking at the country bookshop about how fiction can circle so much closer to truth than nonfiction can. And I think that's such a good, you know, that's what you've done here. And as I've been handing this book and promoting this conversation, I keep talking about how, you know, this is the kind of book that reminds us why we love to read. And I think what I mean by that is that this is an example of kind of what's created when like the tool of the machine of writing is like wielded with very competent hands. And I'm wondering if you might be able to share a few thoughts on like what writing fiction or what writing stories means to you, kind of just as a function of human expression and creativity and conveying information, like as its form of words on paper, as a medium, as a tool.
Mm-hmm. That's a big question.
Yeah, you can ease into it. Because everyone's at this point hopefully watched the other videos, so that's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. As a reader, you know, I like nothing better than just to be totally sucked into a book and not be able to put it down and be communicated with, you know, by this sort of unseen consciousness that created the fiction, but also to be immersed into these consciousnesses that don't really exist, these imaginary people. It's such a magic trick. I think it's like transcendental meditation or something. It's really amazing that reading works the way it does. But when I'm writing, I don't know, it's funny. I've talked about this a lot, but I kind of fell into being a novelist. Like it just sort of was the thing I could do. So I kept doing it. Like, even in college, I started in college. I hadn't written any fiction before that. I wasn't like a little kid who was always writing stories. And so I took a creative writing class, and it was less like I felt like I was expressing myself and more like I just enjoyed in some ways the constructing stories and the puzzle aspect of it. And then, yeah, I was able to write a senior thesis that was a collection of stories, and got a good response to it. And I was like, okay, like maybe, and then the year after college, I didn't know what to do. And I applied to the Iowa Writers Workshop. And so it's really there I got more serious. And probably my second year was when I felt confident enough in kind of the mechanical craft of it that I did feel like I was expressing more emotion, and sort of in some ways I was losing some of the self-consciousness I had right at the beginning, where I was like, is this good? Is this okay? Will this impress people? And once I stopped worrying about that so much, I could write stories that seemed to touch people on an emotional level, which I don't think they necessarily were before that. And then I wrote seating arrangements the year after I finished at Iowa. So I was 25. And like I lived on Nantucket for 9 months through the winter and wrote this book. And I really didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I just had to keep going. And that's also kind of characterized my experience of writing now 3 novels, is that I just have to keep going and kind of hope for the best. And the sort of creative experience of it in some ways is hard to sort of wrap my head around because it's so protracted and it's so diluted just by time. Like more than 3 years, I spent more than 3 years on the first draft of this book. And so it's such a day-to-day thing. It's like some days you feel like you're getting something, like it just flows, and other days it's a total grind, but the stuff that flows isn't necessarily better than the stuff that's a grind. And you can't really evaluate it until it's all done. And it was a really hard process. And I do tend toward language that's about like construction, I guess. And one of my talks was with Curtis Sittenfeld. I think it was her. She was using sort of the same, where it's like, how do you build? Oh no, it's Brandon Taylor. It's like, how do you build this? And that's always what it feels like stacking one thing on top of another.
And even in my notes, I like later on in the conversation, I used the term building the novel.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of along those lines, like the myth making and story sharing and how the different art forms can convey truth, you consider within the work. And I have more questions along this column, but one of the things, the limitations of the book reminded me so much of what happened with Beryl Markham between West with the Night and Circling the Sun. And it's kind of a rabbit hole I would encourage book clubs to consider as a follow-up to Great Circle, because I think the discussion, there's so much that everybody can discuss around this book, but it could be an interesting, couple months down the road to read those 2 books after you've read Great Circle. And I was curious specifically, because I hadn't heard, were you familiar with that particular handling of Beryl Markham's life when you were writing the book? And do you have thoughts about that? Put them in the book, but
yeah, I was familiar, and no shade at all on Paul McLean, but it did strike me as a slightly puzzling project, Circling the Sun, because Beryl Markham had already written I know that West with the Night kind of was published, and then it sort of vanished, and I had this
we sell the crap out of that book
in the 80s, and it's a total classic now, and it's beautiful. and there's always been some kind of like sexist skepticism that she could have written it, and her husband, one of her husbands, was a writer, but there are like manuscript pages from before she even met that husband, so she did write it. And it's such a beautiful book, and it is so elegant, and it conveys so much. And so to me, the impulse to then write a imagined fictional version of her life was odd, because it already existed. And so, yeah, that was part of what I was getting at in Great Circle, with how, Hadley's note, or Marian's notebook that she leaves behind, and then this sort of permutation into a novel, and then that into a movie. So this sort of distortion of a story, as people who are professional narrative makers, like a novelist or like a filmmaker, are trying their darndest, to sort of assemble pieces and to infuse it with some sort of recognizable romantic arc. And so any sort of figure in Marian's life becomes like, well, maybe that was her great love, or maybe this person was. And so I was kind of teasing at that a little bit, I think. And there's so many books that sort of reimagine famous people's lives, and there's the Amelia Earhart one, there's Talking to Curtis Sittenfeld, like obviously she did Rodham and American Wife. And to me, I don't know, I'm not drawn to doing it as a writer, just because I think it can sometimes sap some of the suspense or interest if you feel like you already know the story. But on the other hand, with Hadley's plot arc in Great Circle, I was purposely definitely using sort of points of celebrity gossip that readers would probably be familiar with, like Kristen Stewart and Robert Pattinson, that sort of thing. And on a scale that doesn't take up the whole book, I do like that sort of being in conversation with what the reader already knows that way.
Very much so. And it's enjoyable as a reader to be able to pull that in. No, but I was so excited, about everything in the book, but also to have a vehicle to have that, as a bookseller, to have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone who West with the Night is one of my favorite books of all time, I was just, which is in part why I really encourage book club. I think it's a really interesting conversation to have. But the limitations of other art forms you kind of explore in the book. We talked about the limitations of myth, and to comment back to what you said, you really show how, the book form, you create that entire thing in your head pretty much, and then it's out there. And then, all the minds and visions that go into making a movie. And, but at the same time, you talk to how some art forms can capture something more real, like the way Jamie's portrait of his sister resurfaces and like strikes Hadley. And okay, let me do my other points, then I'll ask my question. And then Jamie's painting during the firefight, like what he can't capture, just the lines on the page in that moment. And I was just wondering, and this is again trying to get, what do you see as the role of artists and writers, like in our society at large? As
in our society, is like, it's funny, I think people absorb so much art without really realizing it, and sometimes there's everything that we watch on TV, and everyone I think watches a lot of TV now, and there's so much TV that exists, like that was created by rooms full of writers. Like living here in LA, I know tons of TV writers and thousands of people, that's their job, is to sort of generate entertainment, at least, an art at most, for all of us. And then it also depends a lot on the sort of replicability of whatever cultural thing you're creating. So, sticking with TV as an example, everyone can access it through their devices. Books, you also pretty much can access, via the library, by buying the book, whatever. And then, like live performance is different. You have to buy a ticket. And it only happens a set number of times, and it's variable. And then I think with visual art, which is probably the sort of most obscure of the kind of art forms, you know, it's increasingly rarefied. Like you have to go out and go to a gallery, go to a museum. Buying it's very expensive. And then music also is something we can all sort of obtain. So I mean, I think art's hugely important, and it brings, you know, meaning and a sense of human connection and community and fandom, you know, and to us. We don't always think about the fact that it's being created by people and by artists. And it's been really interesting just over the years with my 3 books, the way they hit people differently, and people will seek me out for different reasons to convey something about what a book meant to them. And it's funny, I mean, Seating Arrangements, my first book, was kind of a bigger book than my second book, Astonish Me, but Astonish Me, more than Seating Arrangements, seems to have struck certain people just really deeply, and they'll just like come find me. And it's, I think that is gratifying as a writer, but it's still mysterious. You don't totally know what it means to people. And like one woman once like approached me and had this really cryptic thing to say about Astonish Me, where she was like, it made me see things that happened to me totally differently. And she didn't elaborate or go into it. It's obviously personal. And she wanted a picture with me, and then she like vanished into the night. And so anyway, yeah, I mean, I think art connects us to each other as both makers and consumers of it. But it is something I'm also kind of always grappling with in my books. Like in this book, you know, Jamie's trying to in some way convey on canvas how impossible it is to convey the scale of the world. And so he has these like methods for doing that. And so that's in some way me writing about writing this book. Like this book is about vastness. So it's sort of, you know, in some ways metaphorical. And same with Astonish Me, which is about ballet dancers' sort of pursuit of perfection and sort of the tantalizing impossibility of it. So both, and that's, you know, I think writing about writing too. And both these things are about just chasing something that really can't be done. But I think that maybe is part of art too. It's just nothing's ever perfect, but you want everything to be perfect.
I think too, like you were talking in my last question about the magic of writing, because it fuses in the brain. Like the world that you constructed is not the world that each reader constructs. Like
Yeah.
it's infused with whatever, with that woman's experiences. It is, you know, it's the scenes that she's constructing from your words are, you know, mixes of what she has already in her brain. And I think it's fascinating. And, you know, in terms of like capturing immensity, I mean, you've circled very close to something. And I think that's why this book, why it's, you know, up on a billboard in Times Square, is because you succeeded in circling a little closer to something that has been gotten closer to before, which allows people to like carry different things through time. And, you know, I want to talk to you a little bit about the structure of your book, not in a specific way. And I'm going to read a little quote from the logbook on page 505, if anyone's following along. You know, where to begin? At the beginning, of course, but where's the beginning? I don't know where in the past to insert a marker that says here. Here's where the flight began, because the beginning is in a memory, not on a map. And give me a second to like get to my question, if you will. But you know, every author, like by function of what you're doing, is God in this world that you're creating. And what's interesting, one of the many things that are interesting in this book is that the way you have it structured, the reader is kind of allowed to have a godlike view of the world, of this world, in a way, like talking to authors all the time, other authors will do this backstory. They actually know, they've written the backstory of their character generations back, but we as readers don't get to see it, but they've created that. And the way you structure the book, as we get to see the opportunity to see something more as it moves through generations. And then you have, combined with the way you dropped in these short histories that like really allow us to see a longer timeline. And I know in part in the book, you're exploring how a single life kind of measures up against geological time, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the structure of the novel and specific decisions you made while building it to kind of serve that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it took a while for me to realize that that was indeed what I was doing or trying to do. Because, yeah, I'm sure you've heard me say this 10 times before, but I really didn't plan it. I didn't know. I just sort of thought, I'm going to write a book about a pilot, and I didn't expect it to take as long as it did or be, the monster that it became.
The treasure that became, no wisp of a book phrase, the treasure that it became.
Large adult son that this book is. Yeah, so I really wrote it pretty much as it is, with a couple exceptions. I mean, there are a couple of plot lines that got sort of rejiggered, and Marian's flight, which is now at the end of the book in one chunk, used to be broken up and scattered through. But I wrote the very beginning, which is an excerpt from her logbook. And that's one thing too. The little snippet you read that's from her logbook, I had initially tried to write the flight in first person as the actual literal logbook, but it just inevitably was like backtracking over things the reader already knew. It was really inefficient. So yeah, I kind of was working from the beginning forward through her life, or before Marian's even born, with this ocean liner plotline. And then I had the idea for Hadley, and that just seemed like what I needed. Like I just needed something really different, but I didn't know how I would work them together. And then as I wrote forward, I kind of got to this moment where, yeah, I kind of just remember sitting down and being like 15,000 years ago, and wrote this first incomplete history section about Missoula. And some of it, I think, was that, I had spent 2 months in Missoula before I started writing the book, before I even knew I was going to set the book in Montana. And then it was after I left that I thought, oh, that'd be a good setting. And then as I was researching Montana, I came across this this account of the glacial lake Montana, which is in that section. And I found it so captivating. And to me, it just meant something important that I don't think I could even articulate necessarily. And so I just thought, well, in it goes. And so once I did that, then I had the idea to sort of power through a bunch of time, like centuries, to deliver the reader back to the moment of action. And I liked the idea, and I liked how it sort of was, suggesting this largeness around the life of the character. I think inevitably most books are really pretty absorbed within their own characters. And so I was really interested in situating the story in reality, and in some ways minimizing the story, being like, this really matters because this is this one person's life, but it also kind of doesn't matter because just the way time passes and how many people there are. And so then once I'd written that one section like that became sort of a tool that was available to me. And also I had to write more. I couldn't just have one section like that. So it's sort of come back to it during the book. And I think with such a long book too, to me, even just selfishly, and I don't think a lot about the reader, especially in a first draft. I think more about myself as a reader or what I want to do as a writer. And so being able to shift into these incomplete history sections, even when it's just about Marian's life, and to be able to write in the present tense and sort of zoom forward and get a new source of momentum, that was very useful. So it was all a bit happenstance, but then kind of once I had these sort of colors on my palette, then I could start to use them and mix them. And it was really just sort of the main third person voice about Marian's life, the logbook to a degree, Hadley, and the incomplete histories were kind of what I was working with.
I know some of these questions aren't fair because you've written the book, like what it makes, to our earlier conversation, what it makes all of us as readers think about is it, that's for us, that's not for you. And there are a couple things. So yes, and what your histories allow you to do is anchor that enormity, like, of space, and it serves as a very, like, English teachers are going to have a field day with that, like how you, like the technicality of how you use things to anchor enormity in small ways. But there were a couple reference points in the book that for me served as like a through line, that I was wondering if you could talk to as best. It's all in the book, I understand. But one of the things that I thought was interesting about having the multiple generations was you could see how Marian's mother's, like, sexual trauma, that informs the reader's understanding of Marian's sexual experiences. And she doesn't even know what happened to her mother, but we do.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could speak to that in whatever ways you want, but I know it struck me, but I'll keep quiet about that and just.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm drawn to creating sort of echoes and symmetry to the point where I have to resist it a little bit because it can get a little bit tidy. And a lot of it's unconscious. Like, I don't just, once something happens in the book, I think it's then sort of in my brain. And so it'll sort of keep coming back in different forms. And I don't even necessarily notice. It's funny, my uncle's in town, and last night we were driving around and talking, and he's reading it now for the second time. And he said the first time, he really plowed through and just wanted to know what happened. And then this time he's reading more slowly, and he's, watched a couple of my events. And so he was like, oh, I feel like such a dummy. I didn't even think about, how you're writing about disappearance versus death. And I was like, well, it wasn't like I sat down and made a list of themes and then started to construct a plot that I thought would convey those themes. It's like the complete opposite, and I was just trying to really make things happen and move the plot forward and, like, go through this person's life. And then it seems like the other things sort of evolve more subconsciously, and kind of percolate over the drafting process. And then some of it too, you don't really see until the book's done. So it's always really kind of, mysterious how those things happen. Although I did want to plant sort of, with Marian and her mother, like, there would of course be things that come out in her life that are from, this legacy from her mother, and she won't even know, and or just even coincidences, like how in different points in the book they both read Dracula, and they're both sort of troubled by the same character, the sort of madman who just keeps trying to eat as many lives as possible, Brenfield. And the reader can know that her mother had been affected in the same way, but she can never know. And so I think that sort of tension between knowing and not knowing, and what the reader knows and what the character knows, is also kind of a important tool, and also something that can have a lot of emotional impact or content, I guess.
I have another question, but this book, Heartwood, came out a week after your book, and it's a memoir by this a woman with a very interesting life that's always kind of circled around spirituality. That her bio is very interesting, but it's called Heartwood: The Art of Living with the End in Mind by Barbara Becker. And reading it after, I think it's another thing that echoes what you're talking about a little bit, that echo that carries through. I mean, hers is nonfiction, but she's exploring through lives and dying and what carries through, some really interesting things that I think are underlying in here. But to your point about your conversation with your uncle, it seems to me like the artist's role is you are like a conduit, very much so. And that makes sense to me. But I also wanted to ask another thing that kind of flagged for me was the narwhal tusk as this like physical item that moved through it carried so cleanly through, and also the narwhal tusk being this like spiral circle that I really appreciated. And why a narwhal tusk?
I can't remember where it fell in my drafting process, but I've, probably most people have seen them, whether or not they knew, in museums or things like that. There was one lodge I went to in the Canadian High Arctic called Arctic Watch. And if anybody's seen the new Disney Plus series called Secrets of the Whales, in the beluga episode, they filmed the belugas there. So it's this amazing place on this inlet, and hundreds of beluga whales come in the summer. But just sort of casually propped in their lodge, they have a narwhal tusk, and they're crazily enormous. They're like way taller than I am, and I've seen narwhals in the wild too. They're really hard to just kind of from a distance, but there's sort of these, small whales, speckled. And then they have these, like, some of the males have, and all the males and some of the females have these extremely long spiral tusks. So, I was drawn to the beauty of the object. And if you didn't know what it was, just the deep inscrutability of it, like once it's removed from its environment, from the Arctic, where people would recognize it as a food source, if nothing else, it becomes just so mysterious. And that's sort of, decontextualizing something. I thought that to Marian, when she sees this one that her father had come by somewhere, to her, it would signify so much about how much is out there in the world and how mysterious it is, and what sort of wonders she might discover if she can leave Missoula, which is all she wants, starting from childhood. And I think narwhals, some people think, are part of the unicorn myth. They think sailors, were like, we saw these crazy things with these horns, and somehow that has sort of fed into kind of fantastical beasts. So I think they're really interesting animals. I think they're really beautiful objects, and just sort of have a lot of mystery about them.
Sorry about the long pause. I'm looking at my next questions. Jumping over a few because it's okay. Here we go. Seating arrangements and astonish me. You really explore like control and obsession. And so reading your third book, it was kind of interesting to see the through line of some of these behaviors in the book, knowing you've like thoroughly explored these emotions and given up, any reader of your book has also been thinking about this. But I was wondering, in terms of Hadley, Marilyn's grandfather, Marilyn's marriage, like contrasting Ruth's marriage, the movie history, the guardhouses, publicity, public eye, total isolation, men deciding what women can do in war. If you could speak to how what you learned through seating arrangements and astonish me around control and obsession went through this book, or what you took away after those explorations, or
that's really interesting. I think it's kind of a funny thing as a fiction writer that your preoccupations are always, sneaking into your fiction, whether or not you want it to. And there's something a little embarrassing or vulnerable about like, there's this thing is always there. But I think like it's important, and there's an essay about this, I'm blanking on who wrote it, just about like kind of embracing that and how it can be a real source of power in some ways to just like drill down. And so I think more than probably most writers, I'm always coming at things from really different directions. And like, I have a story collection coming out next summer, and my stories are just like wildly disparate. Like they're set all over the place. But I think, actually thinking about them, I feel like obsession and control also, I really do run through them. I was a really obsessive child. I'd have these sort of deep passionate interests for a while, like not that long, but up to a year, and just like it would be all I read about or thought about for a while. I think, as a writer, a fiction writer, you need people to be driven by something. And so I think in some ways it's both, it's just, to me anyway, it's just compelling to think about people being sort of obsessed by something. And yeah, I think too, we sort of understand like Marian, when these barnstormers fly over her, it's love at first sight, essentially. She knows she must do this. And it doesn't really require a ton of explanation. It can be like she just knows. And I think lots of people in one way or another have experienced that and understand it. So I think it's, I think that stuff can kind of sneak up on me. Like I wasn't thinking about my other books at all, but of course, all the thinking I did in order to write those books is still there somewhere, back in the archives. Although I do tend to sort of like purge, like when the book is done, like Astonish Me, I learned a lot about ballet, and then it's just like gone. And this book already, I've like a lot of what I learned to write it is already sort of being fleshed out. But of course there's a remnant, and but it's also a strange thing because as a writer you're also like living your life and getting older. And so when I look at seating arrangements, I still like the book, but I also recognize it as something I wrote in my 20s, and I'm about to turn 38 and wrote this book. This book has taken up my entire 30s. I started it when I was 31. And I'm just a different person, a different mind, and a different writer. And so the way I was thinking about obsession when I wrote seating arrangements is now slightly different, or maybe majorly different. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it takes a lot of thinking about something to understand it better, like, so when you're writing about it, during the book you wrote in your 30s,
Yeah.
it's also, you understand it better. And I think that comes through in how you're able to use it in the characters.
Yeah, and it's both like personal change and just maturation and practice as a writer. Like I've spent a lot of time writing novels now, which when I wrote seating arrangements, that was my first stab. I'd never, so it's this sort of, the way my inner life has changed, then also the way my sort of confidence in my craft has evolved too, I think.
So this conversation being primarily for our local people, Ashley's War is a book. It's a nonfiction book that's been a really big book for us locally, and it's a nonfiction book about the first female, basically women who were special forces, but they were called cultural support team members embedded, and goes into the history of how these women, the military structural history of which it's bloody fascinating, and also their experiences. Anyway, the point is, coming for those people who will likely be listening to this conversation, because thank you, customers, it's usually the same people kind of over and over doing these, but I'm going to have a conversation with two of the women who are now retired, who served in that role. It's called Ashley's War because one of our service women died, and that was kind of the core of the book. But as you were doing your research at the Hoover Institution at Sanford, I can never pronounce that school's name. you talk about going through the letters and reading, and I know you read so much more than what was in your book, and reading about like the intimacy Hadley experiences, reading Marian's letters. I was wondering if there was, and the answer could just be no, but if there's anything you read that might inform my conversation with these women who are also, at a total opposite end of the spectrum of women in the military, but also moving that forward, just in some of the things you encountered, just reading the words of these women who did it first.
Yeah. I read a lot of stuff. I'm gonna unplug this and we'll go over to my bookshelf. Take a quick peek at my dog.
I love that we're getting a tour.
Hi. Let's see. So this book, I don't know how I came across it. I think it was published by an academic press called Love, Sex, and War.
That looks great.
It's really interesting. And it's just about, all the, huge social upheaval that came along with World War II, and didn't necessarily stick through the 50s, but it sort of breaks everything down and is data driven, but also just a really good read. And then I don't know if it's strictly relevant to what you're talking about, but for the books that I use the most for the war part, let's see. This one is called Those Wonderful Women in Their Flying Machines by Sally Van Wagenen Keel. It was about American female pilots who transported warplanes during the war. This is really good. Spitfire Women by Giles Whittell. And then the one I actually read this in maybe one sitting, called Spreading My Wings by Diana Bernardo Walker. And she flew in the ATA like Marian did, in the UK, and is a really engaging writer and was kind of a flapper about town before the war. So I'd recommend all of those. And then the other stuff I read was like a little more, like some of the stuff I read about the Aleutian Islands in World War II is just so specific. It's like not quite worth recommending.
But going through those letters, you said how are they stored? What were those archives like? What did they consist of?
They're just like boxes. And I would it was all sort of messed together, and there'd be an inventory in each box, like a banker's box kind of. And so there'd be photos of these women both during the war and then much later when they'd have these sort of like get together as old biddies. And they're all so cool and so interesting. And then just ephemera that they saved. And then I believe the letters, they were all sort of on just like onion skin paper. So some of them had stuck together and I'd have to like very carefully peel them apart, and all written on typewriters. And I think they were just sort of in folders. And I was there for a few days and I couldn't begin to read them all. So I was just starting to like take pictures, and then read them later, just in some ways even to get like the timing of how the ATA training worked, which was a really interesting way to train pilots. But it felt really, it was really intimate. I think it's really brave of people to donate their papers like that. Although there's nothing, untoward in there, but still it was like, little romances and personal things. And they just had, I think World War II in particular, so many people got a sense of purpose from it and had experiences they wouldn't have had. And then it's this sort of like push-pull with, this is a global catastrophe of like untold scale, and there's so much death and horror. And then for some people, it was also this like, in some ways, the best time of their lives. And I think that tension's really interesting and really poignant in a way.
So most of the people watching this will be watching later as a kind of a book club addendum or something they've already read the book. And we have circled around Great Circle through most of this conversation. As I mentioned, there are two great chats in particular that I'll reference so that people really get, you know, some of the conversations that you've had in various forms over and over again. But as we finish up here, is there anything you want to say, or actually, well, is there anything you want to say about the book, or if the answer is no, because you are completely talked out about your book? I was wondering if you could also talk to the reception. You know, it's been out only a month, and the reception's been exactly what it deserves. Because of how great Circle is. But I was wondering if you could talk to that, or anything I missed asking about.
Yeah, no, I mean, I never have like any burning thing left over. I should probably think of one, but yeah, the reception's been amazing. It's such a long process, you know, like more than 3 years when I was writing the first draft, nobody had read it. And so then two people read it. My agent read it to give me notes, and my mom read it because she wanted to. And then another year went by, and then my editor read it. And so slowly people at my publisher, you know, started reading it in the 2 years and 8 months between when I sold it and when it was published. And so just the gradual sort of process by which it stops being my weird private imaginary world and like more people read it is really gratifying and really interesting. And then, you know, when it's published, it's this like kaboom, and suddenly it's available and people can read it. And, you know, it's super nerve-wracking, I think, the week leading up to publication and kind of the week after, because at any moment, like a book review, like I'll get an email or a Google alert and it's like a book review. And mercifully, they've been really positive. There are a couple sort of weird ones in the UK where they're like, you know, some people are like, does it have to be this long? And it's like, no, obviously it doesn't. Like,
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Yeah, like it's just like, yeah, there's a version of this book that's 250 pages long and is just about Marian becoming a pilot, but that's just not what the purpose of this book was. And then it's, you know, I'm such a like, it's all really abstract, like knowing that it's out there and that people are reading it and responding to it. Like in some ways it's personal, like I get messages and talk to people, that helps make it feel real. But, you know, I'll be on my, like when I hit the New York Times bestseller list and I was on the phone with my agent and I was like, is this good enough? Is this okay? Like, is everybody mad at me? Are we happy with this? And so it can be really hard to internalize that, like, yes, we're happy with this. This is great. It's like, it's a really strange experience. And it's also gradual, like some things you see coming, like the fact that it was a Read with Jenna book and that I was going to be on the Today Show. I'd known for 5 months, but you can't tell anyone. And so like, then when it finally happens, it's like weird that this thing is finally happening after all this time. And yeah, it's interesting. And then, you know, 6.5, 7 years of work and it comes out and has its own life, and I try to move on and do something else. And
no one will let you.
I mean, yeah. At some point I will have to get back to writing another novel, but I'm not even trying right now.
I have two more things. One is I heard you referencing that your next novel might be about two people who get married who don't like each other. And Angie Talley, my children's buyer, and I have been like so pumped to see what your mind would do with that topic. She's like, oh, she can call it the Pearl Year. Like, I don't know.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
I mean, we like, you know, as fans of your work, that is a really intriguing topic. And then one question in the last minute that I wanted to ask, you know, at the end, you referenced in some of your chats how your agent kept asking why would she do this? And at the end, kind of Matilda is asking why. And I was wondering if you included that as a response to your agent, or.
Yeah, absolutely. I did. Yeah, because that conversation is in one of the flight sections, which I completely rewrote between that first draft and the next one. And some of it was in response to Rebecca being like, I just don't get why anyone would do this. And it's funny because I think it's almost an either or. Like a lot of people completely understand intuitively why she would want to do that. And to other people, it's completely baffling why you would take this risk. So I had to sort of think about it. I mean, my agent's questions were really useful because I was like, yeah, why? Like it hadn't really occurred to me. And I'm glad that conversation is in there between the two of them, particularly because I could be in Marian's point of view and she's like, what do you mean, why? You know, she hasn't questioned it herself. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you again for taking the time to chat. This video will go out to everyone who's bought the book at the Country Bookshop. And then also over time, we'll be developing a book club kit thing. In addition to what I'm sure your publisher has done. My last thing is, you know, that section that you deleted, the history of Antarctica, could be a really cool book club kit addendum should you want to like have it as a little Easter egg for people.
Yeah, I feel like that's something, it's so rare to have an excised piece of a book that can actually stand alone, and this can actually stand alone. So I should probably, yeah, try to include it for book clubs or just publish it as a weird essay or something somewhere.
I mean, I want to read it, and usually if I want to read something, so do all my customers, you know, this or I am not the only one ever who wants to read anything. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you. This was delightful.
I really enjoyed it. Have a great day. Enjoy
Yeah,
your
you too. All right. Bye.